Bruchim Habaim. Welcome. So as you just heard from the little Zoom recording, we do record these sessions. So please know that they will be available. These sessions are available afterwards, but also that you are being recorded. And this will be a somewhat interactive session today. So remember that when you're talking, it will be out there on the internet, but hidden in our own little Jewish education world. So welcome. I'd love it if people could open up their screens if they're in a position to do such a thing. So I'd love to see everybody's face. So I see a lot of our regulars and some personal friends and former students, and it's wonderful to see everybody. And this is part of our MaTaRoT workshop series, as you can see from our welcome slide, which I hope you are seeing without this drop down that's making an appearance. Our theme this year is What's the Story? And we are really pleased that for our April session today, we have invited Mishy Harman, the senior producer of Israel Story. In a minute, I am going to even ask you all, how many of you have listened to Israel Story, or how many of you are new to Israel Story? So I'm actually going to stop sharing the welcome slide so that we can see each other. Good morning, everyone. So if you have, hello, Esther, nice to see you. Hi, Andrea. Hello, Shira. Hi, everyone. Hi, Richie. Richie, are you going by Rishona now? Did I see that on some document? No. Okay. All right, great. So yes, please in the chat, and Shirley already did that, please indicate if you've listened to the podcast, if you're familiar with the podcast, or if this is the first time you're going to learn anything about the podcast Israel Story. And please also, so one sort of chat with that, and the second chat, what is your role in the Jewish community? Are you currently a professional working in the community, or are you a community member, an adult learner, someone who has just come on because they know that this is going to be a fabulous hour? So please indicate that as well in the chat. So we're going to spend an hour together today, and we are going to really have a little back and forth with give and take with Mishy about behind the scenes of Israel Story, the podcast that Mishy has been running for, I don't remember how many years. I had it in front of me earlier, but many years, and he'll tell us about that a little bit. And we're going to have a little back and forth to learn more about hear a little bit about the background of Israel Story, but really specifically to focus in on the amazing work that Mishy and his team have been doing, not just in these last 6 months, but really these last 18 months, and to hear how Israel Story really adapted itself and did a deep look at what the needs were in the community of podcast listeners and Israel Story lovers and Israel lovers, to sort of meet the moment, not just since October 7th, but really prior to, did I say August, October 7th, but prior to October 7th as well. So it's really my pleasure to have Mishy here today. You'll hear some of his background as we talk together today. For those of you who don't know me, I am Marian Gribbetz. I'm on the faculty of Hebrew College. I have the privilege of hosting these webinars and collaborating with my colleague Robin Kahn, who's here today as well, on planning these and facilitating them. Robin actually will be facilitating our open questioning. So during the course of the session today, feel free to, after you put in the 2 prompts I asked you to put in, she'll facilitate any questions from the group as well. And depending on how many people end up here during the hour, we may just have a more open conversation as well. Okie doke. All right, so it's really a pleasure to have Mishy with us. You're going to have a fun-filled, interesting, thoughtful, in-depth introduction to the work that Mishy's been doing. and for us to really think together about the importance and the implications of this important work that Mishy has been doing, again, these last 18 months or so. Not that the work before wasn't important, but how it's changed. So Mishy, really, we're going to get to the story of the previous 18 months and October 7th, but love to hear from you. Tell us just, really briefly the inspiration for Israel Story, how you got started, and all that.
Sure. Well, thank you so much, Marian, and it's lovely to be with all of you, despite the sort of dire circumstances and times that we're in. I was just telling Marian that it's especially nice for me since my mother used to teach at Hebrew College when she was a graduate student in the 60s in Cambridge. And as someone who thinks of Cambridge as sort of my other home in life, it's meaningful to be with you. So I see here in the chat that it's a mix of people who have been listening to the show from the very beginning. Susie, who's in her own category here, and all the way to people who are not familiar with the show at all. And I'll say that actually, I'm always so delighted to meet people who are in the world of sort of Jewish education, writ large, however that's defined, who aren't familiar with Israel Story, because even though the show is the most listened to Jewish podcast in the world by a very, very wide margin, the fact that we still have room to grow and to expand and new people to reach is always incredibly encouraging to me. So yeah, I'll just give you a very small background because I imagine that most of what we want to talk about is sort of now. But I'm talking to you from Jerusalem, where I was born and grew up, and grew up, by the way, partially with Susie's daughter Leora, and who's a very dear friend of mine, and I have lived here my whole life. After the army, I came to the States for college at Harvard, and then spent 7 years abroad in graduate school and teaching and so on and so forth. And then I didn't really know what to do in life at some point, and I was one of those kids who was sort of very interested in many different paths, and I was applying. I remember I was sort of in my mid-20s, and I was applying to be a soccer coach in Northern Ireland, even though my soccer skills are sort of mediocre, and simultaneously to be a Mossad agent. And then I spoke to my dear and very wise father, who sadly passed away this year, and whom I miss very much. And he was an educator. He was a professor of education, and worked in his entire life in both education and as and Jewish education. And would you like me to oh, Robin, you're on top of admitting the people? Okay, cool. And he said, listen, if you don't know what to do in life, it's not always a bad idea to keep walking down the path that you're already on. And I seem to be on this academic path. I had spent many years in universities doing various degrees and so on and so forth. And I decided to enroll in a PhD program. And I thought to myself, well, if I stay in the States and do a PhD in America, then, it's a long process, and who knows when I'll come home. I was already, I think, 27 at the time. And I thought to myself, I'll probably meet somebody and settle down, and it will sort of dictate the rest of my life. And so I decided instead, I miss my friends, and I miss my family, and I miss Jerusalem. And I decided to come back to Israel and to Jerusalem, and did a PhD at the Hebrew University. And my mother was delighted about this decision because she thought that I was going to come back to Israel and find a nice Jewish girl and settle down. And then shortly after returning to Jerusalem, I met this really lovely Italian Catholic journalist who is my wife and the mother of our wonderful daughter. And right before coming back to Israel to start this PhD, I decided that, I had been abroad for 7 years. It's a long chunk of time. So I should mark the end of this period in some sort of momentous manner, more so than just boarding a flight at Logan and landing 12 hours later at Ben Gurion Airport. So I bought a Ford Focus station wagon, and I packed all of my belongings, including my dog Nomi, into the station wagon and went on this 15,000-mile long odyssey across something like 45 states in America, which was a real eye-opener for me. And I can talk a lot about that, but I won't. But I'll just say that my best friend Ro'i, who had been my best friend since third grade and is still my best friend today, said, listen, you're going to spend a tremendous amount of time in the car. Why don't I download something called a podcast to your newly acquired iPhone 1? This was all in 2010. And he did. He downloaded something like 200 episodes of This American Life, which I'm sure most or even all of you are familiar with. And I on that trip heard a podcast for the very first time, and I was so blown away by it because even though I was just sitting in my car and stories were coming out of earbuds into my ears, I was sort of magically being transported into all these lives of Americans who I would never otherwise meet. And it was so dizzying and fascinating for me. And all I could think about really was that I should come back home and try to create something similar in Israel, primarily because I don't know how many of you have the great delight of regularly listening to Israeli radio, but if not, I brought you a little snippet of what Israeli radio typically sounds like, which, as you'll be able to hear, sounds nothing at all like your local public radio station. So hopefully this will work. Let's see. What, can you hear or no? No. Yes, can you hear?
No, it worked.
Let me try to fix that quickly while I'm also, oh, there you go. Let's see.
Anita,
Now it works?
Yeah.
Okay.
לא ענית על שאלה אחת, ינון מגל, תודה רבה לך. כן, לא, אתה.
מה ההבדל בינך לבין היטלר, כלב אדום שכמוך?
אז תלך קיבינימט לארצות הברית, אתה והחברים שלך, פשטינקן דרגי קיבינימטי, תעביר אותו מפה, לך לעזאזל.
So as you can tell, that doesn't quite sound like your local radio station. And I came home and I I invited 3 of my closest childhood friends who had all grown up in Noam, this tiny, minuscule, esoteric youth movement of the conservative movement in Israel, to come over to my house. And I said, listen, I'm going to turn off the lights and play you an hour-long radio show. And if you're as excited as I am, let's talk. And luckily they were. And we started what was at the time the very first podcast in Israel. And I'm not going to get into the whole story, but it then became relatively quickly a national radio show on Galei Tzahal, which is the army radio here in Israel. And we did this because we thought that Israel was, as I'm sure all of you have experienced in different ways, a very compartmentalized and fragmented society with people living very, very different lifestyles, all next to each other. And if you take Jerusalem as an example, the city that I grew up in and where I live today, it's a city of 1 million people, and 40% of them are Palestinians who live primarily in Arab neighborhoods in East Jerusalem, and a third of them are Haredim who live primarily in ultra-Orthodox neighborhoods. And even though I grew up in a very open-minded and so I see Noam isn't as esoteric as I was presenting it. But even though I grew up in a very open-minded and welcoming home, the truth of the matter is that I didn't have any Haredi or Palestinian friends, and I barely knew people, frankly, who weren't pretty similar to me. And I think that my experience wasn't unique in any way. I think it's actually sort of a global experience of many people around the world that surround themselves with people who are like them in all kinds of ways. Religion, socioeconomic status, sort of political beliefs, and so on and so forth. And what happens in Jerusalem and in Israel is that because it's such a small place, you're constantly seeing people from other groups and interacting with them, and you immediately take in what somebody has or doesn't have on their head, or what color skin they have, or what clothes they're wearing, and you sort of assign them a label or put them in a box and start piling up all the assumptions and stereotypes that you have about people who belong to that group. And you think with, you build this story in your mind that within a second, a split second, what their dinner table looks like, or their Shabbat table, or what newspapers they read, or what political parties they vote for, what they think about the gay pride parade, or, what they did or didn't do in the army, or so on and so forth. And you've constructed this entire narrative about who they are, without even exchanging a single word. And in fact, that most people sort of end there and don't actually engage or talk in any meaningful way. And we thought that by creating a podcast where you eliminate the visual element, we would give listeners a rare gift, which is a brief moment in which they could listen. They could really listen to the story of someone whom they might not otherwise meet or interact with in the real world. And by doing so, like Edgar Keret says, practice their muscles of empathy. And it became a big show here in Israel. And at some point, we started to think of creating an English language version as well. And we did that primarily because we thought that the narratives that existed about Israel, mainly in the States, and mind you, this is not now, this is a long time ago, this is more than 10 years ago, the narratives that existed in the States were very, very flat and unidimensional narratives that didn't really capture the vibrant, messy, complicated, complex society that we loved. So there were political narratives ranging from, BDS to Hasbara, and there were nationalistic narratives and there were religious narratives. But we wanted to tell a story of our home, which is a very complicated one. It's one of great beauty and tremendous ugliness and everything in between. And we hoped by doing so, look, we're not the foreign ministry, so we had no aspirations to increase support for Israel or anything like that, or make people like Israel. We just wanted to get people to be engaged. To our great delight, again, I'm sort of condensing the last 13 years of my life, but to our great delight, this took off. We partnered initially with an online Jewish magazine in New York called Tablet Magazine, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. And we worked together with them for the first 6 seasons of our show, and then moved over to the Times of Israel. That's it. To our great delight, we didn't know if there was going to be any real audience to this, and we did find an audience, and in fact a large one. And today there's hundreds of thousands of people in about 190 countries around the world who listen to these human interest stories that we tell about Israel. And the organization has grown and expanded in all kinds of different directions. And maybe just to lead, I don't know, Marian, if you want, ready to go into now, but.
Yeah, so thank you for getting us to that point. And I'm sure that was very, very instructive for so many of the group, some who know the podcast well, and some who are just learning about it today. And you're getting a sense for Mishy's enthusiasm and his approach to the world. So I want to fast forward then to 2023, maybe. Okay, and so Mishy, you had this vision of a podcast similar to This American Life that would show the world different aspects of Israel, and maybe not speak to the world, because as you said, you wanted to eliminate the visual. So fast forward now, what's changed? What kinds of adaptations have you made in
we
this
made-
last year?
We made a decision very early on that we were going to be apolitical. And even though we made that decision, the truth of the matter is that I don't totally know what apolitical means. Because especially not in general, and also not in the context of Israel, because I don't know why speaking about a trans Orthodox rabbi is more or less political than speaking about the occupation. Or why speaking about Reform or conservative Jews and their prayer at the Kotel is more or less political. But the way that we interpreted our mandate, in much like the way I think most people interpret the word political in the Israeli context, is that we tried to shy away from the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and the occupation. And that's not to say that we didn't have many, many stories over the years about Palestinians. We did. But by and large, they approach things from a very human interest angle. So just to sort of make that a concrete example, when we did an episode about the separation wall, we in Bethlehem, we chose, instead of many kind of stories that we could tell about, I don't know, women who lost a child in childbirth because their ambulance was held up in a checkpoint or something like that, we chose to tell a story about a cab driver who understood that the wall was a free advertising space, and made it his own sort of private billboard, and spray painted his number everywhere, and became the most popular cab driver in Bethlehem. So you get a sense just from that example that how we tried to approach these kind of topics. And the truth of the matter is that strategy served us really, really well for a really, really long time. And our audience not only is very large, but it's also very diverse. And we're able to appeal to people who hold very, very different views about Israel, both within sort of the spectrum of Jewish listeners, from people who are very active in BDS organizations, to people who are big Zionists, or however you want to define the sort of scale of opinions within the Jewish world. And also we have a very, very sizable non-Jewish listenership, and we're quite data oriented. In fact, I would say data obsessed, and we know a lot about our listeners, and we have listeners who consider themselves very conservative, and moderate, and liberal, and very liberal, and everything from total atheists to ultra-Orthodox Jews, and we have Muslim listeners and Christian listeners, and we were very, very happy. Every single year, in our annual listener survey, we ask a question, in which we ask listeners whether they think that we are an honest broker, and consistently every year, somewhere between 90 and 92% of people say yes, which always made me happy. But what made me even happier was that the 8 to 10% of people who said no, who then receive a follow-up question in which they're asked to say whether in what way we're not an honest broker, are split almost evenly between people who say that we're left-leaning and people who say that we're right-leaning. So I always thought that was a tremendous feat, and I was very happy with that. And then, as Marian said, and I should say that this comes in at a certain price, because both I and my friends who founded the show with me and everyone who works in the show are very active politically. And it's always a bit of a sort of schizophrenic existence to sort of be involved in both municipal and national politics here in very meaningful ways, and then sort of come into the office and be very, very careful to walk a very fine line. And then came 2023, and it seemed to me that not engaging with current affairs was a greater political statement than engaging with them. And the night that Bibi was reelected in November 2022, I guess it was the end of 2022, I was sitting like many other people in this country in a state that is perhaps familiar to many of you from 2016. I decided, for a reason that I wasn't totally sure, to read Megillat Ha'atzmaut, the Israeli Declaration of Independence, which I had last read, I think, when I was maybe in grade school. And it's a really interesting document if you haven't read it. I mean, there are certain passages that are very famous, so I sort of knew by heart, but the document as a whole is a very interesting document, and I highly recommend it. But then I arrived at the very end of the document, and I saw the 37 signatures of the men and women who had signed the Declaration of Independence. And I thought to myself, this is really strange. I mean, of course, there are people here who are very familiar to me, Ben-Gurion, Golda, and so on and so forth. But the vast majority of people are people that I had never heard of. And I started reading each one's Wikipedia page. And it's an interesting thing, because I was, like many other people, and perhaps like you as well, under the impression that the founding fathers and mothers of this country were a monolithic group of Polish and Russian socialists. And it's a little bit like a pointillist painting, that when you come close and up and sort of observe from up close, you start seeing much more variety. And I quickly learned that the group that established the state was actually quite a varied group. It included ultra-Orthodox Jews and religious Jews and total atheists and kibbutznikim and moshavnikim and city folk and real doves and real hawks and revisionists and communists and I thought to myself, the last person who signed the Declaration of Independence died about 20 years ago. And I thought to myself, I wonder where these signatories' children are. And then we embarked on a project for the next year, really, in which we tracked down the closest living relative of each one of the signatories of the Declaration of Independence, and interviewed them both about their ancestor, but also about the promise of Israel as a Jewish democratic state and project, and where we fulfilled that promise and where we fell short, and so on and so forth. And we also had a side project in which we imagined who didn't sign the Declaration of Independence, who were the leaders of that time, who were the prominent people, who were not part of this project. Palestinians, obviously, but Druze and Bedouins and anti-Zionist Reform Jews and anti-Zionist ultra-Orthodox Jews, and by and large Mizrahim. Only 2 out of the 37 signatories were Mizrahim, and by and large women. Only 2 out of the 37 are women. And we interviewed their descendants as well. And it was a real eye-opener for me if you think about it in the American context, 75 years is a long time, but it's also no time at all. And if you think about it in the American context, so 14 out of the 37 signatories still have children who are alive, and all of them have grandchildren who are alive. And we talked to all these people, and we heard opinions ranging from people saying that we heard opinions of people ranging from people saying that Israel is a Judeo-Nazi entity, all the way to people saying that democracy is a Greek import and not something that we should aspire to. And, interestingly, and perhaps not surprisingly, even though only 3 out of the 37 signatories were ultra-Orthodox Jews, today something like 60% of the descendants that are alive are ultra-Orthodox Jews. And on the other hand, some of them no longer live in it. Some of the descendants no longer live in Israel. Some of them are no longer Jewish. And it was a real interesting project for me, and taught me a lot about my own country. I do want to leave time for us to talk about the war and questions. So I'm not going to play you a clip, but I invite all of you to listen to, it's called Signed, Sealed, Delivered, this project about the Declaration of Independence. And basically, we were about a third of the way through releasing these episodes, which I should say, and this is an important, perhaps most of you made the connection yourselves, but just to make it explicit, the project, even though it began sort of as this idea that I had the day that Bibi was elected, the Declaration of Independence became, as the judicial reform gained more and more steam, it became the rallying call for the camp that was against the judicial reform. And as such, and suddenly the Declaration of Independence was everywhere, from a document that was really not at all in the limelight beforehand. It became sort of something that was plastered on billboards, and massive copies of it were on the Tel Aviv municipality and in the Kotel, and all kinds of places like that. We thought that we were telling a story that suddenly became very relevant and very political, as Israel was trying to sort of think in a very public way about its future. And it's important to remember, and it's something that perhaps the war has slightly allowed us to forget, but it's important to remember where we were on October 6th. And where we were was on the brink of a civil war here in Israel, with people with very, very different, very different visions of Israel's future, battling out their ideas in the streets. And the war, for all kinds of reasons that we have all thought about, a common enemy and a shared sense of destiny, and all kinds of things like that, has sort of masked those differences. But I think it's important to say, and especially I mean, this is becoming more and more evident, but I felt that this was true basically from the beginning. I think that this is a temporary sense of unity that we're experiencing here, because I think that those deep-seated differences in how we perceive Israel in the future have not gone away in any manner, and I think that we're going to see them more and more. So, Marian, I see that you're, but I'm going to get now to the war.
Yeah, so I just, before we move away from Signed, Sealed, and Delivered, particularly because most of our audience are educators, and I'm sure people were really, those that aren't familiar with Signed, Sealed, and Delivered were probably sparked by these fascinating stories of these signers of the Declaration. So just before we move to October 7th, I just want to highlight that, as Yom HaTzmaut, Yom HaZikaron come into clearer view, as Pesach is right around the corner, it's another resource for you as an educator to be able to open up the story of Israel from the beginning, from 1948, from the signing of the Declaration, and give a listen to some of the real fascinating stories. So I do want to now segue to October 7th, and Mishy, also maybe say a word about, not literally a word, the original podcast and even the Sign, Seal, and Deliver. How long are the episodes?
For years, we tried to produce hour-long episodes at some point, and with multiple stories in each episode. The Signed, Sealed, Delivered episodes are significantly shorter. They're usually about 20 minutes long.
Mhm.
And I should say that we work with a lot of partners in the Jewish education sphere. The iCenter have been our partners for more than 10 years, and M Squared and the Jewish Education Project, and all of these good people who have taken over the years our content and created educational resources, lesson plans, and if that's something that's of interest to you, I'm more than happy to direct you in the right
Great.
point. Right
Thank
direction.
you. So now
Um,
let's move to October
So-
7.5.
We were about a third of the way through our Signed, Sealed, Delivered project on October 7th. And I'll just say that in 1973, my father was sick on Yom Kippur, and as far as I know, that was the first time in his life that he didn't go to shul. And my mother, who was a relatively new Ola Hadasha from New York, she had two little kids at home. My sister, who was 3, and my older brother Oren, who was 9 months old. She went with them to shul, and then it came back home. And at 2 p.m., as we all know, the sirens started blaring, and my mother, who was unaccustomed to such a occurrence from her upbringing in the Upper West Side, said to my father, "David, what's going on?" And my dad said, "Oh, it's nothing. It's probably just kids playing with the antennas on the roof." And of course, it wasn't kids playing with the antennas on the roof. And that same night, he was called up to the war and spent the next 6 months on the Golan Heights. And during that time, he didn't shave, and he grew a very long black beard. And when he came home, he looked a little bit like a ultra-Orthodox Jew, and my mother didn't like it very much. But my father, who I think both liked it and didn't really love shaving, said that he was going to make it into an ideological statement, and that he was going to shave when we signed a peace agreement with one of the countries that we had been at war with. And just under 4 years later, when Sadat, the same week that Sadat came to Jerusalem and addressed the Knesset, my father shaved his beard. And I told that story on Yom Kippur in shul, in a drasha that I gave this year. And about 10 days later, on Shabbat morning, my wife, who in ways both similar and dissimilar to my mother, is also not from here and is a foreign implant, woke me up and said, "What are those sirens?" And I said to her, "Oh, it's probably nothing. It's probably just kids playing on the roof with the antennas." And of course, it wasn't in this case that either. But unlike my dad, who was 29 years old in 1973, I'm 40, and my miluim days are thankfully behind me, and I, like many other people, in the first day and couple of days, was sort of frantically figuring out how to put one foot in front of the other, organizing blood drives and food banks and sending equipment and blankets and basic items to Bedouins in the Negev and all kinds of different projects. And it was very clear to me that as a show called Israel Story, we couldn't not engage with what seemed like the most dramatic event of the in Israel's in the last generation or whatever in Israel. And on the other hand, we were very ill-equipped to tackle this moment because first of all, our brand of storytelling is very, very different. I mean, we work for very many months on each one of our stories, and they're very carefully crafted and so on and so forth. And also, we didn't know what story to tell because the story was changing every second, really, and we didn't know what we wanted to say, really. And we're not CNN and we're not the New York Times, and we don't have those kind of resources and infrastructure, and we can't follow the news. But it was clear that we had to do something. So I brought in our entire team into the office on the Monday, and we decided that we were going to embark on something completely different and new for us and totally pivot everything that we had been doing up until that point for 13 years. And start producing something called Wartime Diaries, which are not really stories, but rather postcards or slivers of life in which we try to capture the experience of war from all kinds of different perspectives. So on the Tuesday of that week, we conducted our first interview, which we released the following day, which was with a young woman whose sister had been kidnapped and is, by the way, still in Gaza. And since then, we've released more than 50 wartime diaries in which we have highlighted the experiences of families of hostages and survivors and families who have lost a loved one and miluimnikim and every possible civil society initiative that you can imagine, social workers and chefs and musicians and artists and poets and activists and philanthropists and at some point we also started layering in after initially we were releasing these episodes daily. Now they're about once a week. At some point we started layering in perspectives that were from outside of this sort of mainstream Jewish Israeli perspective. So Bedouins and Druze and Palestinians and foreign workers and stories from Gaza. And that was challenging and for some of our listeners, and for some of our listeners very welcomed, and for some not welcomed at all. And maybe I will just play you a 1.5-minute long clip that just gives you a taste of sort of the some of the various voices that we've shared on during these wartime diaries.
The
last time we spoke was the 7th of October at 6:30.
I saw him putting his IDF uniform, and I jumped out of bed as well.
And then we realized there are terrorists inside walking around the kibbutz, but there is no one to come and save you.
הטיל שיוצא מעזה זה טיל עיוור, לא מבדיל בין יהודי לערבי.
Tal Abba is on the way.
For now, I will act like she is alive and captured.
I said, if you want to kill me, would you allow me to die as a Druze?
And we sift through the ashes and we try to find remains of the people there.
I didn't think such a thing can happen again.
I got married this Monday in the middle of war.
You are not a soldier anymore. You are 50 years old. What is the matter with you?
And there's no way on earth I could do this without exactly him. Not a strong partner, great partner. Him partner.
And he told me, take with you a sleeping bag in a tent and just go.
I texted him after I was told that he was killed.
From their eyes, I was a traitor.
Everybody needs their blankie, their teddy bear, something to make them feel safe.
I'm just another grandfather looking after his grandchild while his son is off at war.
Well, what do you expect? You raised me to be this Zionist.
These children of Hamas now will be the killer of my children.
I desperately wanted to talk about sex during my eulogy for Ido.
It's like a couple of kilometers from here. Like, my friend has a 4x4. Let's just go cut across the fields and go get him.
During war, poets, they must write about love.
Everyone has to choose to be optimistic because we don't have room for pessimism.
Those are just a few of the voices that we've shared during these wartime diaries. And I'll just say that our audience that was already very large going into this more than tripled since the start of the war, with sort of the eyes and ears of the world directed towards this region. And happy to share, more ideas and thoughts and anecdotes and stories. But perhaps, Marion, you have a question, or someone wants to ask a question.
I don't know if anyone, I want to open it up for questions, but I also want to, so you got the snippet of what Mishy just shared of those, dozen or so voices, so you can hear the range of the kinds of experiences they're capturing in these postcards. Susie, the iCenter podcast thing, is it only about the wartime diaries, or it's others as well, right?
No, I mean, what Mishy was referring to is that the iCenter has resources that they've created around each of those sets of podcasts that are incredibly helpful to educators. So I just wanted to direct people to that as a possibility. But of course, listening to all of the podcasts on your own is the best and most important way to get to know it.
Yep. So thank you. So so please note that, first of all, Susie is a faculty member at Hebrew College, and my colleague, and she is our liaison to the iCenter. So the resources that she's posting there are from the iCenter. So I do want to also, Mishy, think about just tell people how long most of the wartime diaries are. Because I think that's also a real interesting take, that, as Mishy said, they're postcards, but how long are the,
they're really quite short. Most of them are under 20 minutes, and in fact, most of them are about 15 minutes. I'll say that for me, I mean, yes, it's very meaningful to me that we're bringing this to listeners around the world. And as I said, there really are very large numbers, and people are writing into us, hundreds and hundreds of people are writing in basically every week, saying that it allows them to understand the complexities of what's going on now in a way that goes behind or beyond, what they read in the news or what they see, or and gives them a sense of sort of the breadth and the range of Israeli experiences at the moment. And of course, I want to also be mindful of the fact that we've released about 50 of them thus far, and we are not planning on stopping anytime soon. But there's millions of perspectives here, and these perspectives are changing all the time. And I can also detect an evolution within the series, from going from what was basically a sort of pure documentation project to one that's much more reflective, as our own understanding of the events is shifting. And if early on almost everything was focused on the events of October 7th, now there have been 6 months of events and war and pain and grief since then. And the story is definitely shifting, and we see that also on the national level and international level. And in many ways, you have a much better vantage point we do to that, because we're sort of to a large extent, Israelis are getting part of the story, and living in the States, you're getting perhaps a different, a skewed part of the story, but you're also getting a lot of narratives and hearing a lot of narratives that we're not. And for me personally, you know, they used to say about Yossi Sarid, who was one of the leaders of the left in Israel, was one of the leaders of the Meretz party. They used to say that he, and by many accounts, a real asshole. But they used to say that he loved humanity but hated people. And I feel that this series has made me feel almost the exact opposite. I feel that I think very negative things about humanity. Unfortunately, I think that the last 6 months have really crushed a lot of our hope in what humanity really is in all directions. But at the same time, I feel that I really, really love people, and I have this enviable opportunity to crisscross together with my team the country and talk to people who are really, really very different and living very, very different lives. And I'll just give you, a little taste of that. But, the other day, 2 days ago, I was talking to a father whose son is kidnapped, is a hostage in Gaza now. His son's name is Eitan Mor. The father's name is Tzvika, and they're from Kiryat Arba, which, as perhaps many of you know, is a pretty ideological settlement next to Hebron. And he believes that he's sort of the right flank of the families of hostages, and he believes that just like every soldier who goes into Gaza is essentially saying, I will give my life for some sort of greater good of a victory here or something like that. He believes, and his opinion is an outlying opinion, he believes that if what is required in order to win the war, and the way that he perceives winning the war is crushing Hamas, is to sacrifice his son, in some sort of biblical kind of echo of the binding of Isaac. He believes that's what they should do. And I said to him, it's so interesting. I'm on the complete opposite side of the political map as you are. Complete. I demonstrate every single week against your ability to live where you live. And I'm telling you, I'm not going to defend you in where you live, in Kiryat Arba. But ironically, actually from the left, I can kind of understand what you're talking about, because this ideals of collectivism over individuality are the ideals that people like Tabenkin or people like Berel Katzenelson, the fathers of the kibbutz movement, the socialists who established the state, would embrace. And to complicate things further, the day before, I was interviewing a woman called Daniela Loni. I'm aware of the clock, Marian. I'll wrap up. Who herself was a hostage for 49 days and released on the first day of the exchanges, together with her 6-year-old daughter, Emilia. And she was describing a scene in which she was in the safe room in the mamad and having to make a decision between dying together with her daughter from inhaling smoke because the terrorists had torched the home in which they were staying, her sister's home, or dying by being shot if she climbs out the window. And, the way she was describing it, the only other reference that I have, which is remotely similar to that, is the Holocaust. But 2 hours after I was interviewing Daniela Loni, I was interviewing a 100-year-old Holocaust survivor who on October 8th went to Berlin to recreate the kinder transport that he was on as a 15-year-old boy. And he said that he's appalled by the Holocaust comparisons, and that he was embarrassed by the fact that Gilad Erdan, the Israeli ambassador to the UN, wore a yellow star to the Security Council meeting shortly after the start of the war. So that's just a little kind of encapsulation in my mind of this whirlwind of process, which more than anything for me has been a way to understand and for myself to process all that's going on here. So I feel that it's been a real privilege for me as well, in addition to being able to bring it to listeners around the world.
Great. So first of all, Mishy, always so intriguing and gratifying and really engaging to hear your stories, both on the formal podcast and also in settings like this. And you can tell, I hope, all of our group today, what a great storyteller Mishy is, how passionate he is, and how he brings these stories of the individuals to life and gives us all a window into the heartbreak and the joy and the challenges and the struggles and just the humanity of each of these human beings that he brings to us. And certainly these wartime diaries have really upped the ante, I think, in terms of how we as Jews in the diaspora and Jews who work with the next generation of the Jews of the diaspora can develop the empathy gene and the empathy muscles by having our students and our families and our communities listen to these stories and to begin to have a much more nuanced understanding of what Israel is all about. There's so much more we could be talking about with Mishy. I really urge you all to, surf on over to Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts and find out about all of the podcasts. Surf around them. They're amazing. They're really, really fascinating. Robin, if you can please put the link. We have a little feedback form, so people can please fill that in. It's always very valuable for us.
Yeah, I put it in a minute ago and I just stuck it in again.
Yeah, thank you. I didn't see it earlier. Thank you. So please take the minute and answer the few questions that we ask. It's helpful for us. It's, as you heard, Mishy does collect his data as well. It's helpful for him. And I just really hope that as you leave our session today, and those of you that work in the Jewish community and all of us in the Jewish community, take these stories with us as we approach Pesach, as we approach Yom HaAtzmaut and Yom HaZikaron, and really find ways to share those stories, both for yourself and with those that you will be around the Seder tables with and in the halls of all of our Jewish institutions in the next number of weeks. So thank you, Mishy, so much. Thank you, everybody.
Yes. Quiet and peaceful days to come.
Thank you. Our next session is on May 14th, and we're continuing our What's Your Story theme. And Kayla Reisman from PJ Library will be talking about engaging diverse families through stories. Those of you that use PJ Library know how valuable that resource is in our world. And lots more to come from our department at Hebrew College. Really lovely to see you all. Thank you so much.
Bye. Toda rabba. Bye bye.